I think that the fine itself is probably unsurprising, but the scale of it is surprising.
Why are you unsurprised by the fine itself?
Well, a couple of reasons. It feels to me, as someone that has been knocking around in the internet for over 20 years, despite this youthful-looking appearance, that we have now reached a place where the monopoly position of power is so extraordinary that something is going to give, and there is going to be more critical kind of appreciation of what exactly the internet landscape is and should be. So the fact that Google has been really looked at in detail doesn't surprise me, and therefore when you are going into such depth of complexity and looking at the way their algorithms work and how we as consumers are being faced with information, it's unsurprising that this is a time that now has meant that we're looking at these questions much more deeply.
But the scale of the fine has surprised you.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert in EU law and the way that these things get worked out, but it's clearly a big chunk of money and will surprise the US. As someone who sits on the board of a Silicon Valley company in Twitter, I have been surprised, as I've said to them, at the sort of the lack of interest in a way in a lot of things that are happening in the world. And I think that it's interesting to see how Europe can now be reacting to some of the US tech dominance.
How do you think the US is going to react to that? And in particular, some of these other tech behemoths, the likes of Facebook and so on, who dominate Amazon. They dominate great swathes of the landscape everywhere.
I don't have an answer in a crystal ball, which I can say I definitely think this is going to happen. I think it's quite easy to jump and lump all those companies together, and they actually, to me, behave quite differently and have very different models behind them. I mean, yes, data and that commercialization is at the core of it, but they operate in very different ways. So I don't know exactly what it means for those other companies, but I think it was starting already, but Europe is certainly moved up the agenda in importance for those Silicon Valley behemoths. I think that there's no hiding now from the fact that they are going to have to be responsible in a different way. I would not be surprised if there was much more heavy regulation from many different angles, and ultimately we're probably going to be looking at how if these monopolies should survive as they are in the future.
Well, that's a really interesting point there. You think Google ultimately could face breakup along the lines of something like AT&T was in the past?
Yeah, well, it's been talked about a lot, hasn't it, about are these companies like the big telecoms companies and platforms, and should something therefore give? And I don't know, and I have to say I don't know what my own personal position on this is, but I think that, again, going back to the original promise of the internet, what we found exciting back in the late 90s was this idea of a democratizing, redistributive force with lots of different companies bubbling up, the fact that you could be anywhere in the world and start something, or be anywhere in the world and have access to something. And it's not, I believe, as though these companies are evil. They're not waking up to do a bad job in the morning. I think they're filled with extraordinary people with huge ambitions for the world. But there is also no doubt that their pace of growth and the way that they have controlled and locked down our experience of the internet is still different, perhaps, to how we imagined it back in those early days.
Well, that's it. I mean, ultimately, the European Commission says this is all about choice and that Google has been depriving consumers of choice. How do you reinstate a situation so there is more choice without breaking up a company like Google?
I'm not going to try and work out the future of Google. I think there's much complexity to that question, but this is probably a first step to realigning where the power lies, and perhaps thinking that consumers should have more transparency and oversight of exactly what is happening in their everyday experiences of the internet.
Do you worry that some in the United States, particularly in the White House, may regard this as the first shot in a trade war with the EU?
Any kind of overreaction to what is just a shaking out of how the internet landscape is happening is a bad idea. I think it would be disingenuous on both sides to say that the internet didn't need some kind of corralling and probably some kind of more detailed regulation over time. And I think that that could be a positive thing. It can be a positive thing for consumers, for business, for us as citizens. So I think overreaction from any side is a bad thing, and we just have to remember that we are, to my mind, in this phase of internet growth that's a bit like the teenage years. We had this rapid expansion, something quite different to how a lot of us imagined it might turn out has turned out. Again, no one's getting up to do a bad job, to be evil, but I do think that there are now there is some necessity to just have a more tempered and moderate look at how the next phase of the internet might develop.